React 16 introduced the concept of error boundaries. These let you define a component that will catch any errors that have occurred in components further down it in the component tree. This allows us to catch an error and at least show the user a message, apologizing that something went wrong, rather than leaving them with a blank screen or worse, a broken user interface because of an unexpected JavaScript error that can occur. So we have here the fetch people component, which in reality would make a request to an API to get some data. But in my case, I've just wrapped a set timeout around a set state call to fake some asynchronous API happening, just for the purposes of demonstration. And you can see it returns an array with two people in, name Jack and name Alice. In the render call for fetch people, if we don't have any data, we just return null. And if we do, we map over the data we've been given and just output a span with the person's name and then a rule across the page. And let's imagine that you've built an app similar to this, you've deployed it to production, it's all working great, and then one day the API that you're consuming, maybe it's a third-party API, changes unexpectedly out of the blue. And let's say that rather than the API now returning this array of people like it is currently, it now returns an object where the first key is people. So this is now what our API is returning. If we hit save, we're going to see a blank screen and some errors in the console. And you can see that the error here is this.state.data.map is not a function. And that's because previously data was an array which we could map over, but now data is an object and it's the people key that we need to map over. Of course, the long-term fix for this would be to fix your components to understand the new structure that the API is providing you. But if an API ever does break suddenly, by adding an error boundary, you can at least catch and show a nice error to the user in the interim period until you've been able to fix your API or your front end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this fetch people component alone because we don't need it. So I'll just fold that away. And we can look at our app component. So the first thing we're going to do is have some state in our app component which knows if there's an error or not. And I'm going to set the error to null because by default we're going to hope that there isn't an error. And then in our render call, we will act differently if we've got an error or not. So we'll say return this.state.error. If we have an error, we'll return, let's just use a span saying, sorry, something went wrong. Else we're going to return fetch people. So if I refresh that, we're still saying the same issue. So we're still getting the error that data.map is not a function. And that's because we've created this error in the state, but we haven't actually used it yet. We're never setting it. To turn a component into what's called an error boundary, we define a lifecycle method on it called componentDidCatch. ComponentDidCatch gets called with two arguments, the actual error that was thrown, and info, which is an object with some extra data on. You may or may not care about this, but it can be quite interesting to see what this data is. Now we've defined this function, React will detect any errors that occur in the component tree below the app component and call this function for us. So in this instance, we're going to say this.setState, and we'll set the error. And just for demonstration, I'm also going to log out the error and the info that we're getting as well. So if I save the page and it refreshed, you'll now see we get sorry something went wrong, which is the exact text we want to output here when we have an error. If we look at the console, you'll see that React still throws the error, so your console will still have a big red error. We're not trying here to hide the error so you don't know it's happened, but we're trying to just deal with it for the user. So you can see we still get the same error. If I scroll down, you can see that React has told us where the error happens, and here's the data that was logged. So we get the error, type error, and if we dig into this a little bit, it's a bit hard at this smaller resolution, but you can see we then get info, and you can see the stack of components. One thing to note is that once an error is caught by a component, it won't bubble up any further. So the React documentation, which will be linked to from this screencast, recommends typically having one error boundary component at the very top of your app that you use to deal with all error cases. Just to double check it's working, I'm now going to remove the app, just fold that away. We'll go back into fetch people. I'm going to fix our actual code. So it will now be data.people.map. And you can see now no error is being thrown. So the error boundary doesn't really get involved. We don't set the error state on app and we just see the data we expected.